What is up, everyone? It's Dante Guardi here with the Utah Utes Football Digest. Today, we will be breaking down the Week 1 matchup between the Utes and the Florida Gators, the long-awaited Week 1 matchup. Hopefully, the Utes will be able to get their revenge on the Gators. But today, I'll be breaking down some of the different matchups within the game, in turn giving you a sports betting pick, which I'll kind of break down and go over more towards the end of the video. But jump right into it with the Utah offense versus the Florida defense. So starting at quarterback for Utah, all Utah fans are hoping it's going to be Cam Rising. However, it might not be. Cam Rising said he felt pretty damn good at practice on Monday, and more signs are pointing towards him playing, such as the Vegas line moving from 4.5 points in favor of Utah to 7 points. Now it's at 6.5, but still a lot of fluctuation there, which point more towards Cam Rising playing than not. However, if it's not going to be Cam Rising, it's going to be either Bryson Barnes or Nate Johnson. I want to talk a little bit about how the playbook is going to differ between who's going to be playing quarterback. So with Cam Rising, you're going to have your normal playbook. Last season against the Gators, we saw Utah not really push the ball down the field all too much. Cam Rising really only had one deep pass, a seam shot, a perfect throw to Brant Keithy, which went for about 30 yards, a little bit more than that, a little bit less than that, give or take. But still a very good throw, very good play. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem like Utah is going to be really wanting to push the ball down the field. They didn't want to do that a lot against Florida last year. I see something similar happening. However, with Bryson Barnes or Nate Johnson at quarterback, the playbook is simply just going to be more limited. I think with Bryson Barnes in there, they're going to be emphasizing running the football more, whereas with Nate Johnson, you have him who can run the football. He's one of the fastest players on the team, one of the fastest players in the Pac-12 conference, like Kyle Whittingham has said time and time again. So a little bit more emphasis on the read option and a little bit less on passing more. And if they are going to pass, more passes over the middle rather than outside the numbers, things of that sort, because they just don't really know what Nate Johnson's going to bring to the table. And I think a part of the reason why he isn't the second string quarterback for Utah heading into this game is because he simply just doesn't have the type of grasp on the playbook that Bryson Barnes does. You know, he's been within the program. This is his third, fourth year with the program. Nate Johnson, this is only his second year. So, I mean, just not acclimated to the playbook like Bryson Barnes is. I think that's the main reason why he's not the second string, because if we're talking about a pure talent standpoint, Nate Johnson would most definitely get the nod over Bryson Barnes. So with each of these quarterbacks, you have something different. Nate Johnson's the runner. Bryson Barnes is going to be mainly a passer, and Cam Rising, you're going to get the best of both worlds, and you're just going to get a ton of yards. With the receivers that Utah has, Brant Keithy, Money Parks, and Devon Vele are going to be the three most used targets throughout the season. I believe Brant Keithy, pretty much like a wide receiver playing tight end, can line up all over the field for you. Very good route runner, very good in the open field. That's probably where I like him best. He's really good at making guys miss. So I think those are some of his strongest suits. He's been one of the best tight ends in the Pac-12 for a plethora of years now. I expect that to be the case once again this year, especially with Cam Rising at the helm once again. So I love Brant Keithy. I think he's going to have a great game, especially against these Florida linebackers that don't really have a ton of experience. They got a transfer from Ohio State who still hasn't played in a few years. And even when he was on the field, he wasn't all that impressive. So I do think that Brant Keithy has a very favorable matchup against these Florida linebackers. I thought he did last year as well, and he had a fantastic game. And I believe that those Florida linebackers were better than the corps that they currently boast this season. Talking about Florida's DBs, though, they have an absolute stud at corner in Jason Marshall Jr. He's a true lockdown corner, 6'1", 200+ pound frame, very physical, can jam you at the line of scrimmage, and he's been absolutely locked down during his 2 seasons as a Florida Gator. Last season, he had 8 pass breakups and didn't allow a single touchdown, and in both of his seasons, he hasn't yet to allow a passer rating above 80 when targeted. The Gators, however, did lose their top 3 safeties, but they did add R.J. Moten from Michigan, a very solid player who has 2 interceptions and 2 pass breakups over the past couple of years, has some starting experience as well, and hasn't allowed a touchdown in coverage, which is very impressive. But even then, I do think that Utah will try to stretch the field a little bit more in this game than they did last year. I still don't think it'll be to a great extent. Like I said earlier, I don't think Utah is going to be pushing the ball down the field like that, especially through the air. But I do think that it's more likely for them to take a couple of more shots in this game, more so than last year, because last year they did have some solid safeties, some solid returning safeties, and they also returned both their starting corners last year with Avery Helm and Jason Marshall Jr. Avery Helm's not returning the cornerback rooms, a little bit more up in the air, other than Jason Marshall Jr., who everyone pretty much knows is going to be the guy in this Florida secondary. So I think that Utah's going to be able to move the ball through the air a decent amount. maybe not so much targeting Jason Marshall Jr., but more so the linebackers. I would love to see Brant Keithy get involved a lot in this game because I do think that that matchup that he has against those Florida Gators linebackers is extremely, extremely favorable. So getting into Utah's rushing attack now, it's going to be led by Jaquindon Jackson and Mekhi Bernard. We all know the story about Jaquindon Jackson. Was a former quarterback, one of the best quarterbacks in Texas football history, high school football history, that is. Converted running back last season and really came on towards the end of the year. Had some fantastic performances against Colorado and USC and scored a touchdown against Penn State in that Rose Bowl game. I think this year he's on pace to go for over 1,200 yards rushing. I personally do. You look at the way he ended last season. He ended the year averaging 6.8 yards per carry. Keep in mind, he didn't start playing running back until late September. That Arizona State game was the first one he did. I believe the date was September 26th or the 24th, something along those lines. So he wasn't really too experienced, but he was still playing at an extremely high level. We saw him catch a pass for like 40 yards, nice catch and run during the first drive of the spring game. So he's added a little bit more versatility to his game. And I do think that this is the season where we really see Jaquindon Jackson be a workhorse and be used a ton in a plethora of ways by Andy Ludwig and this Utah offense. You also got Mekhi Bernard back there, who's been a very serviceable running back over the course of his career. He's rushed for over 500 yards a couple of times, I believe. Had scored some clutch touchdowns, had an awesome touchdown against Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, scored a touchdown against USC last year. I think in both of the games, he actually scored a touchdown. So very solid running back there, who can also catch the ball out of the backfield, very sure-handed. That's where he's at his best, in the open space, catching passes out of the backfield, and really just a hybrid running back that can be used for Utah whenever Jaquindon Jackson might not be fit enough to play, especially if he's going to be on the field a lot. He's probably going to need a lot of rest. And Mekhi Bernard is certainly not a bad option to have as your number two. And then you look at Utah's offensive line. I think this Utah offensive line, from a run blocking standpoint, has actually improved over the course of the offseason. They return a couple of starters. They lost Braden Daniels, but they get back Satawa Lomea, who has been one of the best creators in the run game for Utah ever since he stepped foot on campus, really. Struggled a little bit in pass pro throughout the early parts of his career, but has always been an extremely stable run blocker, and I expect that to continue. Whereas Florida's defensive line, they returned one extremely good player, and Princely Maniam, I'm not exactly sure how to say his last name, but a very good run stopper there, a 9.3% stop rate last season, and his average tackle against the run came less than 2 yards past the line of scrimmage last season, which is extremely, extremely impressive. Very, very bulky player, weighs around 250, 260, I believe, and plays on the end. So has been a really strong run blocker for Florida over these past couple of years. Struggles tackling a little bit, but overall is a very good disruptor and makes plays. So that's going to be the number one player on Florida's front seven to watch. However, they do have a couple of other question marks. They got a transfer from Memphis who hasn't played college football since 2018, but he stands 6'7" and weighs 330 pounds. So they have some physical players on this defensive line, but there's not a lot of experience there. There's not a lot to gauge. So it's a little bit more up in the air, though I do trust Utah's offensive line, especially given that Utah was able to run the ball fine against Florida last year. And I do think that Florida defensive line they had last year was a little bit better, given the athletes that they had with Brennan Cox off the edge and Jervon Dexter. And they still had Princely there as well. So they had a very solid defensive front last year. I know Brennan Cox kind of tailed off and he ended up quitting the team, leaving the team or whatever, but he was still a very good player when he was on the field and at his best. So those are going to be big losses for Florida. And while I do like what they've done and how much they trust these players that they've brought in, there's just not a lot to gauge. So it's a little bit tougher to gauge how Utah's going to run the ball, though I do trust the offensive line very much. So now let's dive into Florida's offense versus Utah's defense. Now with Florida's offensive line, another very interesting group, kind of similar to their defensive line, though the players they brought in do have a lot more experience. They brought in a quality starter from Baylor. They brought in another starter from Bama. Doesn't have a ton of experience, but has some experience. Played decently in 2021, so that's another solid player. And they return a couple of quality starters in Austin Barber and Kingsley Egwakin. So got a couple of good players there. And we saw Florida's offensive line last year be extremely good. Like, no matter how bad their record was, no matter how bad they looked in that Vegas Bowl, this was still a borderline top 5 offensive line in the Power 5. And I think they did a good job retooling the line and putting it in a position to succeed once again, especially when you take into account the running backs that they have. Montrell Johnson and Trevor Etienne both played very well against Utah last season. Johnson rushed for 75 yards on 12 carries, scored a touchdown as well. And Etienne only had 5 carries, but he had over 60 yards and really just came on towards the end of the season, really just progressed. Ended up having an awesome freshman season, averaged almost 4 yards after contact per carry and averaged over 6 yards per carry, whereas Johnson averaged over 3 yards after contact per carry and averaged about 5.5 yards per carry on the season. So two very quality running backs. And I do think that this offensive line is still going to be very good. So I think Florida's going to be able to run the ball a decent amount, but the passing attack is where it really gets a little bit questionable. I'm a big fan of this Utah secondary. I like the depth that they have at cornerback. I like the safeties as well. I love Sione Vaki. I think he's in line for a massive season. And you also have Cole Bishop back there, who has just been an absolute disruptor. You take into account the types of teams that would probably be able to beat Utah over the top. It's teams with quarterbacks with just an electric arm and teams with just speedsters, really, and bigger players who can win those 50-50 balls against Utah safeties who aren't as physically fit or physically I don't know how to say dominating as a lot of these other safeties are. Utah safeties are both a little bit on the smaller side, which could lead to problems in the red zone when it comes to 50-50 balls and things of that sort. But I don't think Graham Mertz is a quarterback who's going to be testing Utah all that much. I really don't think so. Mainly because you look at what he's done in the past, there's not a lot to like. Simply put, there's not a lot to like. This is a quarterback that has struggled against big teams, has struggled against good teams. Last season, he averaged 6.6 yards per attempt against only two conference opponents, one of which was Northwestern, who went 3-9. I believe the other one was Purdue. So this is a guy that's always folded in big moments. You look back at that Notre Dame game that he had a couple years ago when he was at Wisconsin. That was one of the worst quarterback performances I've ever seen, honestly. So this is a quarterback that I'm really not worried about whatsoever. The receiving corps, they got Ricky Pearsall back. He was their wide receiver one last year. He caught a few passes against Utah, a player that Utah's now going to be facing 3 years in a row. They faced him in 2021 when he was on Arizona State, faced him last season on Florida, facing him once again on the Gators this season. Good route runner, really shifty player, can make some things happen. So he's going to be their main guy in the passing attack. The other guys, a couple of taller players. They got a couple of guys that are 6'3" in their receiving corps. So some guys that could potentially give Utah issues in the red zone, but very similar to Florida's defensive line. Not a lot to gauge with this Florida receiving corps. So it's going to be a little bit tougher to evaluate, but we're doing our best here. And like I said, I don't think Graham Mertz is the type of quarterback to really make this Utah secondary stress. You know, Utah returns Zemiah Vaughn. He led the team in pass breakups last season as the cornerback too, despite playing next to Clark Phillips. 6'4", one of the fastest players on the team. I think he's in line for a fantastic season. I said this last season as well. I think Zemiah Vaughn has a higher ceiling than Clark Phillips does. I think we can end up seeing Zemiah Vaughn being drafted higher than Clark Phillips was. And that's simply because of his ceiling. You know, like I said, Kyle Whittingham said he's one of the fastest players on the team. He's 6'4". This is another player who didn't come into college playing corner, was a converted corner from quarterback, and is now really settled in position. His ball skills have really come along nicely as well. So I love Zemiah Vaughn at cornerback one this season. You also got Miles Battle, who also stands 6'4", so some lengthy corners who can kind of compensate for the lack of size at the back end of the secondary. So I think Utah secondary is going to hold up fine here. I really do. The only potential mishaps I could see is if Florida's running the ball really well. They use a similar formation that they've been running the ball well with and make a nice play action pass and hit a deep shot or something like that if somebody's wide open. But I don't really see Graham Mertz giving this Utah defense too much trouble. I see Utah struggling to stop the run more than the pass, though I don't think they'll really struggle to stop the run. I think Florida's going to get theirs, but we're not going to look back at this game like last year and be like, wow, Utah really got gashed by the run. You know, like that's exactly what happened last year. So I don't think it'll be like that, but I do still think Florida's going to have a decent time running the football. And I do think there's kind of a path of points there. I think more towards field goals, more towards like a 16-point game than like a 28-point game, something like that. I think they might be able to move the ball a little bit, but kind of get stagnant when Graham Mertz really has to make a play, especially on third down. So getting down to the score prediction now. If Cameron Rising plays, I think Utah's going to be able to score a little bit more than they were if he were to not play. I think that kind of goes without saying. That's not a very hot take. That's what everyone else is saying. So well, that goes without saying. But if Cameron Rising does play, I'm going to say Utah wins this game 28-16. If Cameron Rising doesn't play, it's actually going to be a little bit closer, potentially a turnover in there as well. I'll say Utah wins this game 23-20. If Cameron Rising were to not play, also have to take into account the field position. Utah's going to be moving the ball less. Florida's going to be getting better field position with Bryson Barnes playing quarterback. So if Cameron Rising doesn't play, it's going to be a little bit of a closer score, but though I do see Utah edging out a gutty victory. In terms of the best bets, I don't really love a side here. I really don't love a side here, you know, because Utah is going to be getting the majority of public action like they were last season. And like I said, the quarterback situation is just way too dicey for me. Even if Cameron Rising does play, it's not sure that he's going to be 100%. More likely, he's not going to be 100% than he is 100%. So even with him playing, the playbook will still be a little bit limited. And I do think that for the first half of this game, the opponents are really just going to want to feel each other out. Utah and Florida are going to be feeling each other out, trying to establish the run and not really taking a lot of deep shots. I think with that being said, there's going to be a lesser chance for turnovers, things of that sort. And I think it's just going to be a really gutsy defensive battle for the first half. So for that reason, I'm going with the first half under 22 and a half. I don't think there's going to be many turnovers in this game. I think both teams are going to keep the ball pretty safe. And like I said, for the first half, I think they're both going to try to establish the run to the best of their ability. And for that reason, I'm going with the first half under 22 and a half. I don't see Utah score more than 2 touchdowns in this first half. I don't see Florida scoring more than a touchdown in this first half. I will go with a score of 10-6 Utah at halftime. So the under 22 and a half for me is going to be your best bet. I'd also consider taking a Brant Kuithe player prop when those lines become available. They're not available yet, but when they do, I'd imagine his receiving yard total will probably be somewhere between 55 and 70 yards. I think he'll end up getting around between 80 and 90. So a Brant Kuithe player prop and the first half under 22 and a half are your plays. Bet responsibly, obviously. Goes without saying. Enjoy the weekend. Enjoy the first weekend of college football, and enjoy Utah football more than anything, because there is nothing better in the world than it. That's all for me. This is Dante once again with you, the Utah Utes Football Digest, signing out.